Hello and welcome to Oil and Gas Executive Coaching Live. I'm your host, Joe Sinnott, a chemical engineer, executive coach, and 18-year energy industry veteran, helping you tap into the same resources fueling today's most successful and sustainable leaders. Leaders who are busy, leaders who are stressed, leaders who are exhausted, and leaders who typically don't invest much of their precious time ingesting the nauseating content often found in leadership conferences, town halls, seminars, keynotes, books, articles, podcasts, and of course, LinkedIn posts. Now, please don't get me wrong. Those resources can be valuable, and I've admittedly produced my fair share of fluffy leadership gobbledygook over the years, but there is nothing I produce or ingest that comes close to matching the targeted, timely, relevant, independent support of one-on-one coaching. So today, my plan is to share a bit of that targeted, timely, relevant, independent support with you. Now, I know this isn't a private setting, and I know that I'm going to be doing way more talking than I do during an actual one-on-one coaching session. But I also know that you have lingering frustrations and headaches that you'd love to address as efficiently as possible. So if there is something you're comfortable sharing in this public forum, go ahead and put it in the comments, and I'll happily share some examples or approaches that I, either as a coach or as someone who may have been in your shoes, have seen work successfully or not successfully. And if you're not up for sharing a question or comment, or if the number of live audience viewers drops to 0, then I'll happily step through a number of questions and scenarios that I come across a lot and that are relevant to current events, including, of course, Chevron's acquisition of Hess and all kinds of other M&A activity and rumors. So anyway, as I said, if there's 0 participants today, no worries. That's only one less than my typical one-on-one coaching conversations. And the goal is for you, whether you're watching this live or on demand, to again gain access to the same type of resources that leaders out there in our industry are taking full advantage of it. And so the format today is, as you might be able to see on the screen here, a bit of an RTOC format. Much as our industry has real-time operations centers where data flows in and people sitting in those RTOCs can turn around that data and see things that perhaps those in the field or those in leadership positions are unable to see. That's our format today. We're going to take whatever data is out there, whatever questions you have, whatever observations you have. We're going to weave that all together to help you attack questions, frustrations, challenges that, again, are hyper relevant to you, to your industry, and to your role. So, as I said in the beginning, if questions don't flow in during this live broadcast, no worries at all, because we have enough headlines in the news. There's enough themes out there that lead to plenty of questions and scenarios that I get to tackle in my day-to-day work as a coach. And I'd say the biggest set of headlines out there, of course, has been recent M&A activity, with the most recent being Chevron's acquisition or announced acquisition of Hess. And again, that comes on the heels of Exxon's big news regarding Pioneer, and even some rumored acquisitions when it comes to Chesapeake and Southwestern, which was, I think, last week's rumor mill. So that being said, we'll kick things off with the first question, the first theme that I come across quite a bit. And that is, how do I manage team members who are afraid of losing their jobs? Especially if I, as their leader, happen to be in the same boat. And the first answer to this, and quite frankly, this is an answer to a lot of questions that pop up, is what do you think about addressing the elephant in the room? Instead of dancing around fears and falling into the trap of speculation and making false promises that you can't keep in terms of the stability of an individual's job, why not address the elephant in the room and say, yes, I have concerns too. I expect you to have concerns. What are all the ways to alleviate those concerns? And once you ask that question, again, assuming you're working with a hardworking, innovative, creative team, it doesn't take long to get to the point where everyone in the room realizes that, well, if you're worried about losing your job, you start working on your resume, right? You start exploring what other options are out there so that if you were to lose your job, you're in as good a position as possible. And what's nice about that is it takes all of the hush-hush, the mystery out of things. There's no mystery. There shouldn't be any mystery in our industry that your job is not guaranteed to be there tomorrow. So if you as a leader are in a position to say, hey, I recognize this. What can we do right now to alleviate those fears? What can we do right now to alleviate those concerns? If it's pushing resources towards you to help you polish your resume or your LinkedIn profile or come up with some examples that will be relevant if you find the need at some point to interview for another position, why not do that now? And again, the answer to that rhetorical question is fear, right? Who in their right mind as a manager or even somebody way up the chain in an organization is going to suggest some sort of outplacement services, resume writing services, cover letter services for people who are currently employed, perhaps people that you want to stay there? Why would you want to give them the tools to make it more easy to walk out the door? Well, again, because it's a easy, relatively cheap opportunity to demonstrate trust. And in the context of this question, it's also a great opportunity to alleviate fear. Because if your people are going to be working scared anyway, if they're going to be worried about losing their job, if they're going to be overly worried about their performance, overly worried about the impacts of real or potential M&A activity, well, you stand to benefit quite a bit from removing that fear and anxiety, or at least lessening that fear and anxiety by getting them to a point where if they needed to walk out the door tomorrow or wanted to walk out the door tomorrow, they can do it. Why not move forward with an ideal scenario where your workforce is not worried or not nearly as worried as other workforces at other companies, and in turn can focus on their job, execute well, which interestingly enough will boost their performance and increase their odds of staying at that company should something happen. So again, this is a common theme. This is perhaps an unconventional approach to it, but again, that's part of the lure and part of the value that you get with a focused, conscious conversation that isn't bounded by the polish at times and the fluff of well-intentioned and potentially valuable, but often not terribly innovative solutions to common challenges like this. Moving on to another common question, and that is, my team doesn't think annual objectives matter since the company always changes direction a month after we finalize our goals anyway. And again, this is a common sentiment in the oil and gas industry because things are constantly changing. Again, we're playing off of recent headlines regarding M&A activity, which can lead those in the pessimistic camp to say, well, why do we even ever bother planning? Because, the next big acquisition is always just around the horizon. Why don't we just kind of go with the flow? And while there is some science to more, fluid planning, we're not getting into the planning phase here. We're going to talk about people and how do you deal with people who have gotten to the point where, well, you know what? They're just expecting some sort of change at any given moment anyway. And so why bother? Why do these metrics matter? Why do these goals matter? Why do these objectives matter? And while, again, you can understand their sentiment, that is a sentiment that is toxic. Because if they're not bought into your goals and your objectives, again, you don't need to be a PhD in organizational development to understand that is going to have a negative impact on your performance. So what do you do? How do you tackle this problem? Well, the first piece is make sure that your metrics and your goals are not all so in the weeds and short-sighted and specific, and that some of them are bigger picture. And again, I know this violates the first letter, the first rule of SMART goals, which of course is to be specific. But by and large, companies often, and quite frankly, many individual leaders and employees often overemphasize the specificity of those goals and lose sight of the bigger picture goals. And I'm not even talking about the big picture corporate goals that theoretically, in an ideal scenario, would roll down to everyone else in a manner that allows them to see how connected every individual's goals and department goals are to the big picture. But even just being able to articulate the goals that are associated with a company's mission statement or vision statement. If you can articulate your safety mission, if you can't articulate your company's number one priority, which may be to generate as much positive free cash flow as possible, if you can't articulate your company's mission to improve human lives or to become the market leader in whatever service you're providing, if you can't articulate that mission and you can't have everyone in your company able to articulate that mission, well, there's a very good chance that all of your sub goals are going to be open to all of the changes here that drive a question like this. Because no matter what happens from an M&A standpoint, no matter what happens from a commodity standpoint, no matter what happens from a geopolitical standpoint or a pandemic standpoint or whatever thing comes along, if your high level goals are clear and solid and that's your measure of success, then you have an opportunity to communicate to people who share this sentiment that we have on the screen, that my team doesn't think annual objectives matter since the company always changes direction a month after we finalize our goals. If you don't have the tools and the mechanism to quickly say, hey, here are all the things that are not changing. Here are all the real ways that we should be measuring our success. And yes, within a large organization, maybe you don't have the influence that you think you need to change how metrics are developed. But here again, as we sit in annual planning season, and we're dealing with this very real sentiment, it is up to you to make sure that your goals are, one, clearly connected to high level vision, but two, that you're able to convince your management that you're going to do everything in your power to move the needle on those high level goals. And if that means that along the way, you use your discretion or your team uses their discretion to shift some of those small specific metrics that may be valuable, but may also need to be changed, then you have the authority, heck, you have the responsibility to do it. Because that doesn't happen in your average company, unfortunately. Too often, the metrics that were set, of course, and again, if you work in any sort of corporation, you know this, but the metrics that are set early on dictate all kinds of activity, as opposed to the high level goals, mission, objectives, values, dictating activity every single day. So that's on you to figure out how to do that. Again, if you have specific questions about this, we can go in a little bit more detail about the logistics behind attacking this question, this problem. But there's what I see has worked and can work for you, especially as you head into further into planning season, depending on where your company's at. Moving along to another common question or statement in this case, and that is, I know everyone at my company is busy, but it seems like I am extra busy, and I don't see any way that changes. Is this just the culture? Is this the nature of things? Do I just concede that, hey, whatever it is, whether it's measured in, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks at times, or whether it's measured in stress and anxiety that you carry with you each and every day, do you get to the point where you just concede that, hey, that's kind of what I'm getting paid for, that's the nature of our industry, and put your head down and plow forward? Or do you actually try to tackle this? Again, it's not even a question, right? It's a statement. I don't even know what to do. People are afraid to even ask the question of, well, how do I get less busy? Because that could imply some sort of attribute to you as an individual that is not tolerated in your company or this industry. And I get it. I've been there. I work with many people now as a coach who are in that position. But that doesn't excuse you from asking the question, well, what would be ideal? What would my ideal schedule look like? What would my team's ideal schedule or workload look like? If we could start from scratch and suspend reality for a little bit, how would we proceed? How would we flow through each day, through each week, through each month? That's the type of question that, again, is not easily answered. It's not answered certainly on a live conversation like this over the internet with the public watching. No, this needs to be done one-on-one, or even just with you as an individual, sketching out what would be ideal. And again, this concept isn't new. This isn't unique to me and my role and winning partners. This is a concept that, again, you can find in lots of different leadership books. I certainly point back, as I do in many cases, to Stephen Covey. He tackles the concept of building an ideal week. If you've worked with me, again, that is a big focus of what I try to work on with people. But that doesn't mean it's common. That doesn't mean people who have done this exercise once in their life go ahead and do it again. No, many people in this industry understandably wind up in the same position, sounding like the same quote that's right here. I know everyone at my company is busy, but it seems like I am extra busy. And I don't see any way that changes. Well, it starts with visualizing what would be ideal. What would you want it to change to? From 72 hours a week to 65? It's probably not your ideal, but maybe it is. But you need to answer those questions. And speaking of questions here, as we roll along, for those of you who are watching live or if you're watching on demand, feel free to share your questions. That's why we're here. Yes, you will have seen at this point several questions that I'm bringing to the fold here that are a combination of current, relevant, or common questions and observations that I get and I get to see and I get to help people with as an executive coach. But again, this format, this idea is that it's your questions, live comments, live observations that we can address here together, as you would expect from an actual coaching session. So that being said, we'll keep rolling along with some of these other common questions that pop up. And here's one that, for whatever reason, has popped up more frequently over the last couple months here and has been on my radar. And I've enjoyed helping teams find solutions to this question, or again, more of another comment here, but I've tried all the tips and tricks to improve our company's meeting culture, but we still have too many darn meetings. And again, the language here is PC here. We have a G-rated broadcast, but the moral of the story is that the conclusion that is often reached when we're talking about the sensitive subjects of meetings and meeting culture, often the conclusion is we have too many meetings. And immediately that signals to me that there is maybe not a lack of desire to address that, but perhaps a lack of creativity and innovation to tackle that problem. And what I mean by that is we get drawn into this trap of a false choice between constant meetings, overlapping meetings, having your calendar filled, 80% of the regular working day with meetings, including some on nights and weekends and at all hours. That's extreme and option A. And then the other extreme, of course, is, well, let's just do away with all the meetings and try to get by and be a little bit more dynamic and free up all of this time. And again, it's easy to get lulled into that false choice, that binary choice. But the reality is meetings are necessary, and they're not necessarily a necessary evil if they're run effectively. So when somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm trying all the tips and tricks, right? I'm trying to show up to a meeting with an agenda set and a clear vision of what I want to get out of that meeting. I'm going through and I'm curating the attendee list so it's the right people there. I'm trying to find, the optimal times for these meetings. But it still feels like they're a waste of time and they drag on and they're inefficient. Well, what do I do? What do I do? Do I just give up and we just plow forward, or do we just cancel these meetings and see if we survive and if there's some catastrophe or the stock price craters or whatever? And again, no, those are false choices. So what do you do? What do you do to improve your meeting culture? Well, a lot of it starts with one, recognizing that meetings are the perfect forum, the most common forum, the ideal forum to demonstrate your leadership and for other people to demonstrate their leadership, which is what? It's the ability to communicate. It's the ability to move people forward. It's the ability to clarify, to ask good questions. And so before talking about meeting culture and setting up rules of engagement or whatever you want to do within your company or your division or department or your team, the first thing you do is across the board, make it clear that, hey, these are opportunities to showcase what you can do as a leader. Now, that doesn't mean this is an opportunity for you to get on your soapbox and glom the whole meeting and talk nonstop, because again, that is the antithesis of what a leader should be. A leader should not be on his or her soapbox at all times. A leader doesn't necessarily need to be the one commanding the room and being front and center. No, a leader is there to empower all of the resources that are available, including human resources, to move something forward, to move something towards a goal that he or she has been able to clarify. And once you have established that, once you've made it clear that everybody who's clamoring for leadership training or resources or coaching, as the case may be, once you realize that these people who are inundated with meetings day in and day out actually have regular opportunities to hone their leadership skills, now you've got them paying attention, right? Now you've got them to a point where they're saying, okay, how do I do that? How do I do that if I'm the leader of that meeting, if I'm the person who's called it, or if I'm just an invitee who, typically would just sit there quietly unless I'm called upon or see something egregious that I need to address? How do I do that? And then once that question has been asked, once there's genuine curiosity, now you focus on those in-meeting strategies and rules of engagement. Because it's easy to check the box, relatively easy, I should say, to check the box on coming up with an agenda and clarifying the purpose of the meeting. You can get to the point where almost robotically you can show up and you can do that, and you can tackle probably 50% of the complaints that people have about meetings. But once you're in the heat of the moment, once you're in that meeting and you need to prevent the meeting from going off the rails, you need to prevent that meeting from running long, or best case scenario, you need to prevent that meeting from actually just expanding to the length of the meeting. If it was 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and recognize that, hey, if it could be done in 5 minutes, it could be done in 5 minutes. All of those things are strategies that will invigorate people, that will energize people, that will get them to the point where they want to attend these meetings. And it's up to you, whether you're the leader of that meeting or a simple attendee, to employ some of these tools. Now, again, the tools specifically, that could be the subject of another one of these conversations. It's the subject of workshops. It's the subject of talks, of keynotes. You can go on to YouTube and you can find all kinds of tips and tricks out there to employ. But I'll give you one of them. One of them starts with understanding, clarifying if need be, what the purpose of the meeting is, and then constantly using that as a filter to bring people back to the center, to speed people up, to remind them of why they're there. Because far too many people that I see sitting in meetings, both as a participant and now as a coach, more often as an observer of meetings, is that people are too scared to stop people from talking and to do it in a tactful way that simply brings people back to the agreed upon purpose of that meeting that was clarified at the very beginning. Now, again, that's just one tip. That's just one tactic, but that is by far the most important one that you can employ right away to not just lead more effective meetings, to not just get people into the zone where they just want to clear their entire calendar, but to get people to the point where they're running effective meetings that don't just get stuff done, but also demonstrate their ability to be a leader, to be a communicator, and to be an effective collaborator and facilitator, and whatever other synonym you want to throw in there. That being said, and keeping this meeting of sorts flowing along, let's move on to the next question here. And this is another time-related question, whether it's, again, you're just overall busy or you spend a lot of time in meetings. But here's another one. I spend so much time and energy trying unsuccessfully to manage up. How do I make that easier? Now, again, in the context of a coaching conversation, this is typically one of the more sensitive ones, and typically one of the more conversations that requires confidentiality, because it's very easy to talk about specific instances of trying to manage up, to communicate upwards, to manage your manager, if you will. But one common theme, similar to what we just talked about from a meeting standpoint, is listening for what that ultimate purpose is. Listening for what, just like you would listen for what a successful meeting would be, listen for how your manager, your boss, or whoever it is you're managing up towards defines success. What ammo has that person already given you that you can use to get their attention? Because so much of managing up is getting and keeping the other person's attention, right? Especially when you're managing up to people who are busy, who might not be able to focus on your most pressing need because they have 10 other pressing needs that they need to focus on. So your goal is to get their attention. So how do you do that? How do you get the attention of somebody so that you can then get across what you want to get across, which is, in essence, the definition of managing up? Well, it starts with using their words against them. And again, not in any sort of negative way. I know that doesn't sound good, but in essence, if you have words, if you have things that they have said, if you, as a listener to this conversation right now, if you told me that your number one goal was, I don't know, to make $1 million this year, and I knew that there was something that I need to communicate to you that you're just not getting, you're just not hearing, you're just not responding to for whatever reason. And again, I've exhausted all kinds of time and energy trying to get you to listen to me. Well, why wouldn't I start with the ammo that you've given me? If I said, hey, you, audience member, I know you told me a couple months ago that you wanted to make $1 million this year, right? And I also know that, that you have a little bit of ground to make up in the second half of 2023. And I don't know if what I'm going to share with you is going to get you there necessarily, but I do know it's going to greatly increase your odds of getting there. And here's what I think. What's nice about that is, of course, you've gotten their attention, but you've also set things up to share what you think, share what you want to say in a position where, again, they're going to listen to you. What you didn't do is start on the defensive and start giving all of the tools, all of the minutia, all of the details, giving that upwards to your manager or whoever for them to try to figure out, for them to try to solve. That's when managing up goes sideways or southways. I guess if it's the opposite of up, it's down, whatever you want to describe it as. By and large, what I see is people who struggle managing up spend too much time starting with the details. And that gives the person they're trying to manage up to permission, in essence, or they see it as permission to ignore the conclusions, ignore the recommendations, ignore the headline that you're trying to get across. So there's, again, a high-level piece of advice. When there's more tactical people in mind, or when there's a specific message that you're trying to get across, whether it's related to your organization or a project or potential customer or things that you identify as a problem within your organization. Again, sometimes those require a little bit more targeted approach, but by and large, start with the ammo that you've been given and make your life a whole lot easier. And moving along here, again, if there's no questions from you, the audience, right now, we'll wrap up with one more question that, again, is relevant to really all the questions we've asked about today, but certainly the first one. And that is, everyone seems to either be in self-preservation mode or apathy mode. Surely there is some healthy alternative to those, again, two binary choices, if you will, of how to approach life. And again, I say this is hyper relevant because in this day and age of mergers and acquisitions, and again, on the heels of Chevron's announced 60 billion or whatever their number is, again, all these 50 to $60 billion acquisitions recently, it's tough to lose track. But with that, like we talked about at the outset, people are worried, right? People are scared. And we talked about some strategies 20 minutes or so ago about how to attack that. But how do you deal with one of the ongoing issues that you run into in companies, even at times when people aren't scared about mergers or acquisitions or some of the big picture industry items? And that is this idea of self-preservation. And the reason I say that this exists all the time, and it's not just out of fear, is because there's often a narrative that is constructed around an individual, that he or she is a self-preservationist. And all of his or her actions are viewed through that lens. Fair or not, it becomes very difficult for that individual to shed that. And the problem is that self-preservation isn't necessarily a bad thing. Self-preservation isn't necessarily a demotivator, because having your best interest in mind is logical, right? It's innate, right? I think it's in our DNA. We want to survive, right? We want to protect ourselves. But the distinction between, say, self-preservation and some of the items we talked about with the first question, in terms of getting to the point where you're not scared to lose your job, the difference is between long-term and short-term. Because a lot of the self-preservationists that I've encountered, again, in my prior role and now in my role as coach, they tend to have a much shorter-term view of self-preservation and protectionism. Whether they realize it or not, a lot of their actions don't speak to long-term goals. They don't speak to a long-term desire to build their teams, to get themselves to a position where they are a recognized expert and generate long-term value. Typically, that self-preservation mindset is reflective of a very short-term approach, very short-term thinking. And so the question is, when you're trying to work with people either on your team, or again, maybe it's a little bit of managing up or managing over, when you're working with people who seem to be in that self-preservation mode, it goes back a lot to what we just talked about in the previous question, managing up. And that is understanding what the long-term goal is, what the long-term vision is for that individual. Because once you can do that, you can reshape self-preservation. You can reshape their short-term actions that actually aren't aligned with their long-term goals. You can actually help them see that they're actually damaging, their long-term prospects unwittingly in many cases, to put in a plug there for my company Witting Partners, where again, a lot of people don't realize they're doing this. A lot of people don't realize that they're unwittingly damaging their long-term prospect because of their behaviors, which in many cases are manifested as self-preservation approaches. So your goal, whether it's again for yourself or for somebody on your team, is to start with the end in mind, if you will. If you want to throw a cliche in there, another Stephen Covey-ism, start with the end in mind and work backwards. And it becomes a lot easier to identify those patterns where you're not doing yourself any good if you're a self-preservationist. And the other half of this question is, well, all right, it seems like everybody's in self-preservation mode, or they're in apathy mode where they just don't care. Again, whether they vocalize it or not, they just don't care. They're apathetic. But again, it's the same approach to solve either end of this equation. And that is, well, helping them understand what their long-term goals are. Perhaps apathy makes a whole bunch of sense, at least in the work environment, for their long-term goals. If their long-term goal is to, get fired or something along those lines. But at the end of the day, if apathy actually is a problem, and clearly in an organization it is, it's typically because the individual, again, is unwittingly limiting their chances of success, unwittingly hurting their odds of achieving their long-term goals. And it's up to you, especially if they're in your purview, if they're part of your team, to help them understand that. And once you do that, then that is the healthy alternative. Recognize that, hey, every decision you make, the filter should be, am I getting closer to my ultimate goal or not? And if you're doing that, apathy goes out the window, self-preservation goes out the window, and you find yourself or your team marching closer to whatever that ultimate destination happens to be. So with that being said, I thank you for tuning in to this inaugural edition of Oil and Gas Executive Coaching Live. The intent is to continue doing these on occasion, and again, continuing to offer some glimpses into the world of executive coaching and some of the insights and experiences, again, obviously without violating the confidential nature of what I do, so that you can move forward more efficiently, more effectively, more confidently, and again, gain access to the same resources that executives within our industry get to enjoy to help them be more effective. If you're interested in more content like this, although be it with a little bit more of perhaps an advocacy bent to it, and touching more on high-level themes and current events, as opposed to addressing your real-time questions like our executive RTOC, our executive real-time oil field coaching scenario we have here. If you're looking for some of those high-level, long-lasting ideas, insights, then I do invite you to flip over to a different forum. That is the Energy Detox Podcast, also available on LinkedIn and on YouTube and on any podcast platform, and at theenergydetox.com, because a lot of the themes that we touched on today are embedded in the 80 plus episodes, but they typically go into a lot more detail. So whether it's communication, managing up, decision making, establishing metrics and objectives for yourself and for your team, many of those episodes, again, are done at a much deeper level, while still trying to weave in whatever topic du jour or headline du jour happened to be in the news or in conversations at that given moment when the episode was recorded. So again, the Energy Detox, if you're looking for a little bit more, and if you're looking for a little bit more of this style of sort of improvisational Q&A on-demand coaching, then be on the lookout here. We're in the trial period here of rolling these out here as it kind of aligns with my schedule, and quite frankly, and again, we talked about having an ideal schedule. I will admit that part of this broadcast today is because we already had a live session here as part of the SPE Tech Talk. So I was happy to host that a little bit earlier, and it made a whole heck of a lot of sense. It aligned with my schedule to go ahead and bleed over from that into this conversation and take advantage of that mindset, if you will. So again, I challenge you, as we talked about earlier with some of that Q&A, to ask yourself how you can align your day, your week, to do what is ideal to make sure that your time is well spent, your time is well invested, and you're not wasting time on a bunch of generic fluff, generic gobbledygook, generic tips and tricks and videos and podcasts and articles and books and seminars and LinkedIn posts that are not efficient for you, that aren't aligned with the level of work that you have, the schedule that you have, the demands that you have. And so I hope that if you've stuck with me to this point, you recognize that, as with coaching, the goal here is to be as precise, as specific, and as relevant to you as possible. So with that being said, and to avoid the irony of rambling on and actually wasting your time, I'm going to sign off here and thank you once again for joining us on the initial rendition of Oil and Gas Executive Coaching Live.